Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Firstly, the pandemic. I mean, Russia has lifted most of its lockdowns. It's different region by region. But Mikhail, maybe to you firstly, Moscow certainly is back to business, 12 million people. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, that is I would say, the mixed feeling among people. On one hand, just we understand that it's still in Moscow and whole Russia, we have every day we have new cases by 8,500 cases every day. And simultaneously, Mr. Putin ordering just to perform the parade, military parade, with the participation of almost 70,000 militaries. And also he appointed voting of approval of his amendments to the constitution for the 1st of July. And there is a absolutely mixed feeling. And what I'm hearing from regions and official statements of governors, one to another, they canceling those parades, local parades in their cities, the capital of regions, because of this pandemic. Because of
well, in fact, I think that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think you know, earlier in the week they were saying 10 cities had canceled, and then now they're saying there's another 3 that have canceled. Yeah. So Maria, if I can ask you, President Putin told state TV on Sunday that the American response to the virus and recent anti-racism protests were a sign of deep-seated internal crisis in America, which has recorded the highest overall death toll from COVID-19, as we all know, in the world. But he claimed that his country was emerging from this epidemic with minimal losses. What's he saying there? Do you believe him?
Well, President Putin really just says to his people that he wants all of them to come and to support his constitutional amendments on July 1st. And that's why he needs to sound very optimistic and positive about how Russia handled this crisis. But as Mikhail correctly pointed out, we are actually quite uncertain about the numbers. If anything, there was a great work by Russian statisticians who demonstrate that pretty much all of the available statistics on the coronavirus deaths and coronavirus infections are fake. And you can literally see, because the numbers are distributed in a very, horizontal way and a completely artificial manner that demonstrates that the officials just are afraid to show any high numbers. So that is a problem. But most importantly, I would just add to Michael's answer to this question that the Russians are primarily concerned not so much about the coronavirus, but about the economic well-being, particularly given that the Kremlin did not really provide Russians any carrots throughout this crisis, in the sense that there were sticks, people were forced to stay at home, but there was no extra payments by the government in order to help them sustain through this crisis. And as a result, many of them just really have to make the ends meet, and therefore they need to go and work. One of the indications, by the way, is the unprecedented collapse in the consumer sentiment rating, which is only comparable to the crisis of 2008. So the economic situation is quite worrisome for the Kremlin.
All right, I know Mikhail loves to talk economics, and so, but before we come back to that, I do want to mention that as you were talking about statistics, in fact, Echo Moskvy, the radio station that generally is a real opposition radio station, it has been in Moscow, reported this week that nearly 6,000 more people died in Moscow during May than on average, putting Russia among the worst hit countries in Europe. And if you can just help me understand, Mikhail, why is it important for the Kremlin to lie about the numbers? I mean, why don't they just come clean about it?
That's the old habit, Soviet-style habit, and all authorities continue to perform that way, what they used to do before, because just, all the leaders, all just ministers, they all came from the Soviet Union, and they had this spirit, they had this habit to perform this way. And then when they started to realize that, in fact, just in Russia, the actual statistics is really lower than in Europe, and they had decided to double this. It's still 3 times less than in Europe, average in Europe, but they doubled what the previous reports were. But in fact, what is Maria correctly mentioned right now, people are curious because of the situation, social and economic situation. You know that all these three packages Mr. Putin announced, that's cost only 2% of GDP. You know, just all European countries, including Great Britain, US, and European countries, they're performing with this support of people and businesses like 8–10% of GDP. Russia has this money available for this, but Mr. Putin doesn't want to spend this. That's why people realizes that they cannot already perform just as they did even in February or in January. And in fact,
I think it's really important what we're talking about.
Businesses already canceled participate in those programs Mr. Putin offered to them because those special schemes offered to them are ineffective. That's why there is no actual support of businesses, no actual support of population.
Although he still has 60% popularity, that's not bad. I think most world leaders would be happy to trade their popularity right now for a 60% figure.
I would argue with this too, because that's 60% of popularity. That's not something actual. In fact, he always had like 45%, between 40 and 50%. And in fact, just all the elections, just only one time Mr. Putin won elections. It was the year 2000. All other elections were just with falsification. It was the results were not credible. And in fact, even mathematical researchers of those people who involved in the elections, they calculated it was always 46, 45, 49%, but never more than 50%, never. A part of the year 2000, when we he got 51.5, something like that.
If I may jump in, as a matter of fact, 2 points I wanted to add to what Mikhail said, which I really very much agree with. First of all, the reason why the Kremlin wasn't in a rush to spend the money, it has to do with the fact that it introduced the so-called holidays rather than an official lockdown. That means many state-employed people in Russia will continue getting their salaries, while people who are employed in private businesses effectively were left without any sources of incomes. This is just another strategy where Putin and the Kremlin tend to actually give favors to what they perceive as their loyal constituencies, which are at this point disproportionately are the people employed by the state-owned or state-linked enterprises. But most importantly, the Kremlin really expects the situation to get much worse, not right now, where we already observe an unprecedented decline in Putin's approval, but actually in this fall. And one of the reasons why they've been saving this money is actually to be able to assuage the situation and the protests when they start erupting, which what they predict will be actually later. Right now, people are primarily concerned about making the ends meet, and this is, in this sense, it's not a completely irrational approach.
Maria, you just co-authored a great analysis piece in Foreign Policy, and the headline is that the coronavirus could hit Putin most of all. What do you mean?
So, by the way, also to go back to the point about the ratings, Mikhail says that 60% approval is not a reliable number, and it's true, but it also remember that we're talking about polling in autocratic system. Even when people respond honestly to the question, who would you support, who would you vote for if the election was next Sunday, they still are really making the choices in the situation of a complete lack of alternatives. And what it really tells you in a non-free society, right, when someone unknown calls you on the phone or knocks on your door and asks you, hey, you know, who are you gonna support next Sunday, right? It's what it actually tells you, and that's actually not my point, but my colleagues, Denis Volkov, the sociologist from the Levada Center, is that about a third or more of people are not afraid to say that they will not support Putin. It's maybe in the situation of autocracies, it's worth looking at how many people do not say they will support a given, you know, irreplaceable leader, rather than at how many people say they will support. Also, as we point out in the Foreign Policy article, the situation is really not good for Putin. As I have mentioned before, the consumer sentiment is, the collapse in the consumer sentiment is only comparable to the 2008 financial crisis. And if you think that nothing has happened after the 2000 financial crisis, and it's true, at the time the situation was relatively stable, you're wrong, because as a matter of fact, many polls demonstrate that the 2008 had such an effect on people in Russia that finally sort of had its, you know, outburst throughout 2011, 2012.
Right, we started to see these street demonstrations, and I think Mikhail, you were arrested at one of them, were you?
Yeah, that was long ago. Yeah, in fact, I think that there's right now there is no desire of people to go on the streets, but in fact, by coming fall, by autumn, the situation will change considerably, and it's now is being changing right now, and people already started feeling that they had to openly criticize, and in fact. And many people who are forced now to go to vote for Putin's amendments, and these people working for the government and getting money from there, from different institutions. I wouldn't say just the government and ministers, but on the level of different organizations. They, in fact, they don't want to compromise with their conscience, and that's why they're saying just if they are pressed to depart, the people even ready to lose their job. Just not.
You're both Russian. Will you help me understand something? And that is
yes, what's going on.
And Maria, you
waking up.
Yeah, I just don't understand why Russians are willing to accept a lot of this. And Maria, you wrote in your story, and I've been, I was 12 years in Moscow as a correspondent, and I follow it. And you've probably given me the most succinct sentence I have read about understanding the Russian psyche, and you can explain it if you don't mind, that Russians historically prioritize the state's ability to provide social rights over civil rights. So they're willing to swallow unreal elections, not, they're sham elections by European standards, but because the Kremlin provided certain pension minimums and social rights, they have been willing to turn a blind eye to a lot of what happens in terms of the way the Kremlin manipulates the situation. Is that what you mean, and that they're not prepared to do so now?
That's absolutely true, and Russians are not really that unique in this sense. Most societies are traditionalist, paternalistic, in the sense that they primarily expect the state to deliver, to provide the certain social goods to them, and it takes a while for societies to evolve to the understanding of the necessity of the civil rights. Even in Europe and the West, these countries took centuries to develop this understanding. In Russia, which really lacks sustainable experience of democracy, this understanding really is yet to come. But what we see in the polls is actually that Russians are increasingly awakening to the understanding of the importance of freedom of speech, of the civil rights being protected, as also the Kremlin is running out of resources to be able to deliver the social goods, as we demonstrate. And this is a new phenomenon. In the last 3 years, on different indicators of civil rights, we see an increase. The Russians increasingly view that as more important, partly because they really have been able to satisfy the primarily, so to speak, economic needs earlier.
I was going to ask Mikhail here, is part of that also about the fragmentation of the message? Because up until now, the Kremlin's been great at controlling radio and television, but I mean, more and more, you have the fragmentation of internet, and people are getting real messages and real truth from different sources.
Yeah, in fact, in the big cities, when people just every day using internet, the popularity of Putin and the whole just his authority is very low. In Moscow, I believe it's not more than 15% or something like that in actual support. But of course, in the rural areas and industrial centers, just in Siberia somewhere there, in Urals, just a little more, because they continue to believe, as Maria correctly said, just there is no alternative work to do. Yes, not good life, but Putin promised a better life. And people around him, ministers, wrong guys, but Putin is great. That's why let's support him and expect him, he will deliver to us something. That's this feeling continue to prevail in those regions, but the situation is being changing.
So does this add up to the Kremlin is under pressure, Putin is under pressure, the economic situation is worsening, and that's why maybe they shouldn't be lifting the lockdown on COVID-19, but they're doing it now because they want to get this referendum done?
they want to get the referendum, and they want the economic situation to restore. As I mentioned before, economic considerations are the key correlate that really shows that explains the dynamic of Putin's approval. And in light of the 5 years consistent decline in real disposable incomes in Russia, they really need the economy to at least somewhat start picking up, because otherwise, really, they're creating pre-revolutionary situation in Russia. And just to follow up on my earlier point, where I compared the current situation with the 2008 financial crisis, what's different here? Like, we heard a lot, like, so Putin rating was down before, so what's new about this situation? What is new is that we are facing this major crisis comparable to 2008 when it comes to the consumer sentiment. It's a situation when the Putin's approval has been consistently declining for several years in the row, and people are getting tired of Putin. Putin is increasingly becoming a liability. It's very visible in the ratings and the way people talk of him. He is no longer the strong macho man the way he used to be. And this is very new. It's very unclear how the Kremlin is going to try to manage the current situation when pretty much people are tired of him, very, very tired of him personally. This hasn't been.
Well, if they're getting tired of him, they better buckle up, because there's a lot more to come. Because if he wins this referendum, he will be able to stay in power until 2036.
He already won the referendum. He already won the referendum. That's fake. That's not a referendum. That is voting, illegal voting. Because just Putin didn't want to have a referendum. As I mentioned to you earlier, there is only 2 forms of voting in Russia, which is Constitution provides for. That's election or deputies, whatever, president, etc., and referendum. Putin just didn't want to have referendum, and the constitutional judges just described to him and to people that those changes which Mr. Putin introduced are the minor sense. That's why just there is no yet referendum. But Putin still wants just demonstration of people's love to him. And this is just artificial, just positioning. It's nothing to do with the legal consequences. And the results are already clear. They already said it will be not less than 60% turnout. There will be not less than 65% approval, etc., etc.
They already know what the turnout is, and they haven't had the referendum yet.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's already
it's a very stable country. We already know the results before the election took place.
Well, I think in some of the regional votes, they've had like 110% turnout, and in some of these elections, they've had some pretty strange numbers. But Maria, you wrote at the end of your article, and sort of keep referring back to it, but I'm interested in, you said Putin himself could become a liability to the very system he has created by 2024, the year of the next national election. These changes may become deep enough to represent fundamentally new challenges to Putin's ability to sustain his hold on power. You think it's going to boil between now and then?
This is unusual, as I mentioned before, since Putin himself is no longer an asset. Before, for pretty much 20 years, Putin was this person who really held the whole personalistic autocratic system together because he was so popular because of this quote-unquote legitimacy of his. We see that this is the key element that's been under erosion at the moment, because people are growing tired of Putin personally. This is, as I mentioned before, reflected even in the jokes that people, joke around. This is new, but unfortunately, what actually has been missed by the West in the midst of this pandemic is the fact that Putin de facto eliminated whatever the votes left from the election in Russia. As Mikhail also correctly pointed out, that when new changes introduced to the electoral laws that effectively allow the Kremlin to falsify anything they want at all. There is no observers. There is a distant voting that will be done, the so-called electronic voting. We're not a single possibility of monitoring exists. Even before that, there were not as many, but right now they will be totally eliminated. And the first try will be during this unfortunate constitutional vote on July 1st. It's essentially the Kremlin understands that they no longer can win even the rigged election they used to do in the past. So right now they de facto eliminated all election at all, and that creates a big challenge for the Russian opposition how to deal with this really new sad reality. But definitely one thing for sure, interesting times are coming for Russia. The Kremlin is no longer as stable as it used to be, that's for sure.
Mikhail, last word.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just in fact, Putin right now just very nervous about just destroyment of his original plan, which he announced in the middle of January. Pandemic destroyed it. Then then fall down of oil price destroyed it even more on that. Right now we have minus 6% of GDP deficit of the budget, and that is the problem. And Putin already allowed central bank to print money somehow to neutralize the problems of the budget, what we're already facing with. Minister of Finance doesn't know what to do because just this is contrary to monetary vision of the whole policy. But that is the fact, and the government is not working not as a team, as assistants of to Putin. And by autumn we will have a considerable problem. Right now, they even cannot develop the draft budget for next year because they don't agree with the general aspects of the situation. They cannot judge what the oil price would be. They continue to believe that Russia will have economic growth this year as 1.7%, which is absolutely wrong, will be minus 6-7%, and they expecting that next year will be 3% of GDP growth. That's how just they would like to feed people with this information. That's already Soviet Union style. It means the beginning of the end.
Mikhail Kasyanov, the former Prime Minister of Russia, great to talk to you as always. And Maria Snegovaya is a fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and her research includes Russian domestic and foreign policy. And a gift to hear both of you today, give us some perspective on what's happening in Russia. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.